Hello, class. My name is April Cohrs. We are in British Literature, English 3040 at Central State University with Dr. Walkowitz. For my final project, I am revisiting William Shakespeare's Sonnet 18, which was written in 1609. The reason I chose to examine this piece of literature is because I am a hopeless romantic and I believe William Shakespeare to be the greatest of all time. I did not have the opportunity to attend a traditional university after high school, but I married someone who has his master's degree. I remember holding his collection of Shakespeare's works in my hands with reverence and awe. I knew there was a value there, but I didn't have the means to understand until now. The works of Shakespeare evolve in meaning every time I experience them. About 15 years ago, I attended my first live play, which was Love's Labor's Lost, at the Oregon Shakespeare Festival in Ashland. This was my first real exposure to Shakespeare. I felt like I was in a sacred space, having been transported back in time. It didn't take long for me to synthesize the language and to pick up on the humor. Last summer, we attended The Tempest. This summer, I'm looking forward to going back for Romeo and Juliet and Twelfth Night. In reading, rewriting, deconstructing Shakespeare, outlining possibilities, sometimes humorous, for Sonnet 18, Cohrs claims that a feature of many of Shakespeare's sonnets is a tension inherent in them because of the way in which passion would seem to be represented and controlled by and within conventions of the sonnet form itself. We could say that in love poetry in general, and in the sonnets in particular, the reckless impulses of creation, and sometimes of lust and desire, are controlled by the medium used to express or represent them. While this may be a fairly conventional commonplace, Shakespeare consciously took advantage of this tradition in order to exploit his possibilities in different contexts and sometimes in an ambiguous manner, which in turn provides a degree of depth to the sonnets, which leaves room for a variety of interpretations. He furthers the opening lines of the sonnet play on the proverbial formula, quote, as good as one shall see in a summer's day, quote, meaning, quote, as good as the best there is, quote. However, it goes on to refer to the way in which time affects beauty. Summertime alludes to a season which is hot and fertile, the tenor of which is the possibility ardent and passionate state of the addressee, although the first irony is that the shoe is probably on the other foot, and the voice in the poem admits that this is an inappropriate metaphor. The person addressed would seem to be more beautiful, yet less passionate, and the passion of the speaker is what shakes or alters this basic state of what might be fullness or maturity or perhaps even innocence, as the bud has not yet opened. If we free the text from its supposed context, then we might suggest that the violent passion disturbs a newly discovered sexuality, or it may be the tranquility, rather ambiguously, of either his or her state, or both. It has been mentioned that Shakespeare responds to existing traditions and conventions in plays with the possibilities of the given meanings and connotations of certain situations, images, and even words. If we begin with the possible significance of summer itself as associated with the young man, then Ovid has provided us with connotations of strength, lusty youth, fertility, heat, and health, although this also suggests thickness, firmness, and strength, which one associated with the amorous texts, speak for themselves. There are just juxtapositions which give rise to ambiguity. More lovely is modified and might be seen as in opposition to temperate, which originates a paradox with when great beauty is described at once as temporary and moderate. And this in turn is linked to the way in which the summer's day and the temperate are also set up in opposition, allowing the possibilities for interpretation. Interpretation for passion and its control, as well as its passing nature. In the same way, we find the contrast between rough winds and darling beds, the hot eye of heaven shines, suggests excessive passion, but is counterpointed in the antithesis with, quote, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, quote, which suggests the wanting or passion or excitement or even beauty, which in turn links up with fair and declines, which also hint at the passing nature of beauty. Cohrs continues that the relation of similarity in terms of the connotations of nature untrimmed and summer not fade, which are in clear opposition to death shade, or the valley of the shadow of death, also fit in with the idea of passion or arousal, which will not cease in spite of, or even perhaps because of, the inevitability of death. We also find the term gravest, which is full of connotations which can be associated with nature too. The text deliberately juxtaposes a number of words, the connotations of which we readily associated with beauty, strength, fullness, and sexual arousal, which are in turn related by opposition to those parts of the text which suggest temporality and decline. Cohrs writes, the basic tension felt by the speaker in the addressing the anonymous addressee ought to be apparent. His or her beauty is tempered, or he is controlling his reaction to it. He or she is darling, but he is rough. There is a contrast between the powerful meaning or sexual excitement, hot, shines, and its loss, fair, declines, although fair refers apparently to that beauty. But the associations in the poem tend to suggest more than admiration, but a passion that continues more than a simple testimony to the power of poetry. Uncontrolled nature and a summer that will not fade suggest the continuation of physical passion, and in the face of death's shadow, this passion grows. Cohrs says, once taken out of its supposed context, the addressee is anonymous. There are a variety of possibilities, each of which changes our interpretation of the poem. It is left to the reader now to reread and reconsider the possible significance of the poem in the light of the following possibilities, which are the result of the overtly ambivalent nature of the text. The most obvious is that the addressee is an anonymous loved one, male or female. Given the ambivalence of the opening and the clear allusions to the speaker's passion, the addressee may be the speaker's own desire, a growing possibility, given the connotations of the comic parody is, however, that the addressee is the male speaker's penis. Cohrs impresses that, far-fetched as it may seem, this kind of erotic playfulness is a feature of Shakespeare's work in general, as well as of much other Renaissance poetry, and the admirable quality of the sonnet is that it allows such a broad and extravagant variety of possibilities. Although the meaning of the poem is traditionally given, a reconsideration of the sonnet as text, which frees us from the imposition of a more conventional interpretation, opens up a wide variety of possibilities. For example, Sonnet 18 signifies the traditional language of admiration, love, and respect, belonging initially to this context. Cohrs states that if, again, we place the given context in the background and consider the sonnet as text, then it signifies in terms of the language of love, which it should be insisted, is directed ambivalently to an unidentified addressee. Tradition would suggest that the addressee is more appropriately a woman. It also suggests that the feelings expressed are chaste, although the ambivalence created in the poem stems from the way this kind of interpretation is at odds with the connotations of the language used, and the series of associations we have already described highlight the validity of a very different kind of interpretation. For some, the sexual connotations of the sonnets, combined with the fact that they are addressed for the most part to another man, are grounds for speculation about Shakespeare's homosexuality. But it should be insisted that the poet is working within a clearly marked tradition. His discourse is conventional, and the apparent sincerity only covers up an underlying playfulness which stretches those conventions by putting them to a different use. Cohrs offers, let us say then that a sonnet of this kind foregrounds many aspects of the nature of language and discourse which are not always associated with Renaissance literature. On the one hand, the sonnet is typical as it does borrow from tradition, or traditionally, stories were stolen, as Chaucer stole his, or they were felt to be the common property of culture or community. These notable happenings, imagined or real, lay outside language the way history itself is supposed to, in a condition of pure occurrence. Shakespeare is clearly indebted to tradition here, but the self-conscious nature of much of his writing, and here we include Sonnet 18, draws attention to how the frontiers of a book, or any text for that matter, are never clear-cut. Finally, Cohrs states, rereading Shakespeare with what we can also call, from this standpoint, poetic license lends further possibilities to the poem, possibilities which belong fundamentally to the poem itself, and which can be found if you look for them. However, these alternative readings exist precisely because of this tension brought about by subjecting matter to convention. The comic irony of Shakespeare is often the result of showing accurately what otherwise might be considered undignified, and this sonnet is a case in point. Consider a good deal of artistic creation of this period, which depended on patronage, was precisely of this kind.